General rules of intestacy. When someone dies without leaving a valid will, they're said to have died intestate. With no will to refer to, administering an intestate estate and deciding who gets what is governed by the rules on intestacy, which are set out in law. If the person died leaving a surviving spouse or civil partner, please see our video on intestacy and the surviving spouse first. Unlike administering an estate where the deceased left a will, the law says only a person who is going to benefit from an intestate estate can deal with its administration. You can, however, employ a professional to do some or all of the work for you. Classes of relatives. The rules on intestacy divide the deceased relatives into classes. A class is simply a group of people who are related to the deceased in the same way. The classes and their order of priority are surviving spouse or civil partner, children or grandchildren, parents, brothers or sisters of the whole blood or their children, brothers or sisters of the half-blood or their children, grandparents, aunts and uncles of the whole blood or their children, aunts and uncles of the half-blood or their children. If the deceased has no living relatives in the first class, then attention moves to the next class and so on until the estate's administrators find a living relative. If the deceased has no relatives in any of the classes, then the estate passes to the Crown. Important points. Deceased relatives, whole blood and half-blood relatives, and children are all special cases when it comes to administering an intestate estate. Deceased relatives. Some classes mention certain relatives or their children. This is because if a relative, for example a brother, would have inherited from the estate but died before the deceased, his children can inherit in his place. It's important to realise that not everyone in the same class will necessarily benefit equally. Using the same example, any nieces or nephews of the deceased only receive the share of the estate that would have been passed to their father, which is then divided between them. Whole blood and half-blood relatives. The rules of intestacy distinguish between full-blood relatives, with 2 parents in common, and half-blood relatives, just 1 parent in common. This means half-blood siblings are in a different class to siblings who have the same 2 parents as the deceased. These differences mean you need to check exactly how people are related to the deceased and each other. Children of the deceased. The rules of intestacy say biological children, both legitimate and illegitimate, and children legally adopted by the deceased are entitled to inherit. That means stepchildren, biological children of the deceased who've been adopted by someone else, and someone raised as a child of the family but never legally adopted aren't entitled to inherit. Top tip. Understanding the exact relationship of family members to the deceased can be challenging. For this reason, it's important you get evidence in the form of birth, marriage, death, and adoption certificates.